Four Mysteries, UFO Encounters. Encounter in New Hampshire. It was around 2:45 a.m. on a Friday morning in 1973 that Linda Morell found herself fighting sleep behind the wheel of her car. As she drove down New Hampshire's interstate, a bright light caught her attention. The further she drove, the brighter and closer the object in the sky became. Soon, her vehicle began increasing speed and pulling to the side of the road on its own. She drove as if under the guidance of the looming bright object that was now almost above her car. It was at that moment that Linda was able to see that the light was some form of craft being piloted by a small gray humanoid creature. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before or since. Linda, a masseuse, had left work earlier that morning and met with a friend for a quick cup of coffee before going home near the town of Goffstown. While traveling down Highway 114, she first noticed the bright light in the distance. It flashed a yellow hue before changing colors to green, blue, and red. Linda didn't think much of this and continued down the desolate stretch of road to her destination. As she approached a quiet and dark intersection, she lit a cigarette to shake the sleep off, and that's when she noticed the bright object had vanished. It was only after she accelerated through the intersection that it reappeared in her field of vision. Her attention was now completely focused on this object that seemed to be following her on her journey. The object began to disappear again, only to reappear brighter and bigger than before. Linda's sleep was replaced by a growing worry that this object was anything but a star. It was near the town limits of Goffstown that the strange object finally caught up with her. There, in full horror, Linda was able to make out the details of the bright object, which was obvious to her now that it was a form of craft she had never seen before. She would later describe it as a gold and orange glowing globe that appeared to be covered by hexagon shapes. It almost looks like a honeycomb. She then was able to see an opening in the craft. An oval-shaped window with what appeared to be some form of humanoid at the controls. Suddenly, bright blue, green, and red flashes of light engulfed her car and illuminated the dark road around her. In the chaos, a loud high-pitched whirling sound became increasingly louder. She was unable to take her hands off the steering wheel as if the craft had somehow taken control of her and her vehicle. The out-of-control car raced past the West Lawn Cemetery, as the craft got closer and lower to the road. At that point, Linda could fully see the occupant inside the craft. To her horror, she saw a little figure behind the oval window. She described it as having a round, grayish head with an unsettling wrinkled face, a slit for a mouth and two large eyes with large, dark pupils. As she looked at it and it looked back at her, Linda sensed that it was trying to communicate with her through telepathy. She thought the message said, "Don't be afraid." At that moment, she gained control of the wheel and steered the car right into the first driveway past the cemetery. Linda then jumped out of the car and ran towards the house, pounding on the front door and screaming for help. She was in complete hysterics. The craft had stopped and positioned itself across the house, hovering above the tree line and still emitting that high-pitched noise she had heard earlier. The front door finally opened, and Mr. and Mrs. Baudouin stood in their nightgowns, puzzled as to what was going on. There, cowering on their front porch, was Linda. She was covering her ears and saying that a flying saucer was after her. Both Mr. and Mrs. Baudouin looked around the property and up at the night sky. It was as quiet and still as it had been for them the entire night. Finally, a few minutes later, Mrs. Baudouin called the police to report the erratic woman's claims. Minutes later, Goffstown's officer Daniel Jubenville finally arrived at the residence. He noticed Linda's abandoned car in the driveway. The headlights were still on and the engine was running. After listening to Linda's story and being satisfied that she was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, he wrote the incident down in his report and headed back to patrolling the roads. As Daniel Jubenville has noted, the planet Mars was near its brightest and was in the western part of the sky where Linda saw the object. However, that does not explain the other events that she claimed to have occurred. Note also that this sighting occurred only about 100 miles from the site of the 1961 Betty and Barney Hill abduction event. Linda Morell never found an explanation for the strange events that unfolded that Friday morning in 1973, Florida Scoutmaster. The case involved a scoutmaster in West Palm Beach, Florida, who had been close enough to a flying saucer to reach out and touch it. In fact, he probably would have if it hadn't stunned him first with a heat ray. The incident must have really shaken someone in the Air Force, because, unlike the Washington sightings, Ruppelt received all the assistance he needed to investigate. Colonel Weldon Smith, in particular, expressed great interest in the case. And Air Force B-25 came to Blue Book's disposal to give Ruppelt and his assistant, 2nd Lieutenant Robert M. Olson, personal and speedy transportation from Dayton, Ohio, to Florida. In addition, Ruppelt was under no time constraints. He even received special assistance from 2 other Air Force captains, Hoey and Davis, who flew down with them and remained to assist. Upon arrival, the attic team heard an interesting story from the witness. He was a curious character. A Marine during the war and supposedly a widely respected man around town, he was also Scoutmaster of Troop 33. Because the incident took place right after a meeting of the troop and involved some of the boys, it has ever since been referred to as the Florida Scoutmaster case. According to the Scoutmaster, D.S. Sonny Dave Vergers, it all began while he was driving 3 scouts home that night. He turned off the coastal highway and down an inland blacktop to go where one of the boys lived. After traveling about 10 miles inland, he noticed a bright light in the palmetto thickets. At first, he passed by it, but then he stopped some way down the road and turned the car around to go back. He hesitated in doing this, but could not help feeling that the light might have been a fire, perhaps indicating a crashed airplane. Despite the pleas from the scouts who did not want to be left alone, Dave Vergers got out of the car and headed into the thickets, a very dangerous thing to do in the snake-infested South Florida swamps. About 50 yards off the road, he entered the dense thickets and pushed through the waist-high brush. Suddenly, a sharp, pungent odor came across him. The temperature also seemed a little warmer as he pushed 30 yards further through the undergrowth. Chopping the brush with a machete that he had taken from the car, Dave Vergers lit his way with one of 2 flashlights she had on him. From the car, the boys could see the flashlight beam and track its progress from its reflection. Knowing this, Dave Vergers periodically paused and shined the light up on the tree canopy. After moving near an opening, he stopped again to signal his location. Suddenly, at that very moment, Dave Vergers felt overcome by a suffocating moist heat. He paused, wondering if the supposed clearing was actually a quicksand-like bog or a pond. Luckily, the ground was quite solid, but by this time he had become a little more concerned about his location. He cast the beam of the flashlight down so he could look up at the stars to try to figure out what direction he was facing. But to his great surprise, the stars were gone. There were hundreds just moments ago, but now there are none. Then he realized they weren't all gone, just the ones directly above him. This just couldn't be, he thought, unless something was above him. As his eyes slowly adjusted, he realized there was a large oval object hovering only about 30 feet overhead. Slowly stepping back from this frightening situation, he shined his light on it. Now he could clearly see a concave bottom beneath a smooth gray circular craft. Stepping back some more, he could see a dome on top of the object. The edge of this saucer looked like it had evenly spaced vanes every foot, with a type of nozzle between them. The former Marine was, to say the least, humbled by this sight and continued to give the craft further space. Suddenly, however, he froze in his tracks. A horrifying sound came from the craft. It was the sound of a door, just like a heavy metal safe makes when opened. Feeling as angry as he was scared, he then found himself helplessly enveloped in a red mist. It seemed to originate from a ball of red fire slowly being expelled from the craft. This overwhelmed him, causing Dave Vergers to lose consciousness. In the car, the boys, Bobby Ruffing, Chuck Stevens, and David Rowan, claimed they saw their leader become surrounded by a big red ball of fire. Severely shaken by the sight, the boys piled out and ran down the road as fast as they could to the nearest house. They found a farmer who called the state police, who were soon on the scene with a deputy sheriff, Mott Partine, to pick them up. Partine then drove the scouts to the site of the occurrence to find Dave Vergers running out of the woods. He stated that the scoutmaster appeared sincerely frightened, more so than he had ever witnessed anyone else to be in all his years of law enforcement. The officers went into the thicket and found one of Dave Vergers' flashlights still burning near some flattened grass where he had apparently collapsed. His second flashlight was never found. Once they got him to police headquarters, officers noticed that Dave Vergers' hands, arms, face, and cap were all burned. Although the police may have been somewhat doubtful of the heat ray story, they decided to call the Air Force and thus initiated the investigation. Ruppelt personally questioned Dave Vergers upon arriving in Florida. He did so at regular intervals, determining that he remembered details well but did not repeat them in a rehearsed or exact manner. Ruppelt's experience with hoaxers indicated to him that this testimony stood in great contrast, showing sincere answers. An Air Force flight surgeon then examined his wounds and likened them to a mild sunburn with indications of singed hairs, suggesting, in his words, a flash heat source. The scoutmaster's nostrils also showed signs of burns. Ruppelt examined the site of the encounter and found nothing to contradict the story. Nor, however, were there signs of scorched earth or grass, or residual radiation. But curiously, although not revealed until after laboratory tests were conducted in Dayton, the roots of the samples of grass extracted at the scene were charred. This puzzled Ruppelt because his team personally collected them. They were from the undisturbed ground, and while they didn't pay any attention to the roots at the time, the grass blades were certainly not burnt. The scorched hat also fell under lab scrutiny, which suggested it had been damaged by sparks of some sort, possibly electrical in nature. Ruppelt felt satisfied that it had not been burnt prior to the incident, as the boys had handled it earlier that night at the scout meeting. In fact, Ruppelt personally questioned the boys, even dressing in civilian clothes during the questioning so as not to intimidate them. His impression was that the boys were sincere, even though they did not all give the exact same details. It started to look like one of the better cases, perhaps the best case yet, but then things fell apart. In those early days of Blue Book investigations, background checks were still conducted. The checks revealed Dave Vergers had been a Marine, but not a decorated hero as he often bragged. His records only had a dishonorable discharge to show for his war service. Nor was Dave Vergers a widely respected citizen, as he claimed, just widely known. Local area citizens stated that he was a likable enough fellow, but all agreed that they wouldn't believe him if he told them the sun was shining on a bright Florida afternoon. Another complication arose when Ruppelt later returned to the area of the sighting and determined the scouts could not have possibly seen Dave Vergers overcome by the mysterious flame, even if they were standing on top of the car looking for it. The foliage was just too dense. And although Ruppelt interviewed the scouts again, he did not feel they were part of a hoax. Yet he did file it as such in the official report. Hasselbach, Germany. Oskar Link, a former Wehrmacht major, and his daughter Gabrielle, 11, had to leave their motorcycle when they had a flat tire. Inside the woods, the girl noticed two men in silvery suits examining the ground in a clearing near a pink disc-shaped object, 13 to 15 meters in diameter, with a double row of openings around the rim and a black turret on top. One of the men had a flashing box. Both men went inside, and the disc vibrated, rose along the turret-like cylinder, then spun faster and rose out of sight. Berlin, July. With the sworn testimony of an eyewitness, Oskar Link, a 48-year-old German and former mayor of Glamershausen, West Berlin, intelligence officers have begun investigating a most unusual flying saucer story. According to this story, an object resembling a huge flying pan and having a diameter of about 15 meters landed in a forest clearing in the Soviet zone of Germany. Link recently escaped from the Soviet zone along with his wife and 6 children. Link and his 11-year-old daughter, Gabriella, made the following sworn statement last week before a judge: "While I was returning to my home with Gabriella, the tire of my motorcycle blew out near the town of Hasselbach. While we were walking along toward Hasselbach, Gabriella pointed out something which lay at a distance of about 140 meters from us. Since it was twilight, I thought that she was pointing at a young deer. I left my motorcycle near a tree and walked toward the spot that Gabriella had pointed out. When, however, I reached a spot about 55 meters from the object, I realized that my first impression had been wrong. What I had seen were 2 men who were now about 40 meters away from me. They seemed to be dressed in some shiny metallic clothing. They were stooped over and were looking at something lying on the ground. I approached until I was only about 10 meters from them. I looked over a small fence and then I noticed a large object whose diameter I estimated to be between 13 and 15 meters. It looked like a huge frying pan. There were 2 rows of holes on its periphery, about 30 centimeters in circumference. The space between the 2 rows was about 0.45 meters. On the top of this metal object was a black conical tower about 3 meters high. At that moment, my daughter, who had remained a short distance behind me, called me. The 2 men must have heard my daughter's voice because they immediately jumped on the conical tower and disappeared inside. I had previously noted that one of the men had a lamp on the front part of his body which lit up at regular intervals. Now, the side of the object on which the holes had been opened began to glitter. Its color seemed green at first but later turned red. At the same time, I began to hear a slight hum. While the brightness and hum increased, the conical tower began to slide down into the center of the object. The whole object then began to rise slowly from the ground and rotate like a top. It seemed to me as if it were supported by the cylindrical plant which had gone down from the top of the object, through the center, and had now appeared from its bottom on the ground. The object, surrounded by a ring of flames, was now a certain number of feet above the ground. I then noted that the whole object had risen slowly from the ground. The cylinder on which it was supported had now disappeared within its center and had reappeared on the top of the object. The rate of climb has now become greater. At the same time, my daughter and I heard a whistling sound similar to that heard when a bomb falls. The object rose to a horizontal position, turned toward a neighboring town, and then, gaining altitude, it disappeared over the heights and forests in the direction of Stockholm. Many other people who lived in the same area as Link later related that they saw an object that they thought to be a comet. A shepherd stated that he thought that he was looking at a comet moving away at a low altitude from the height at which Link stood. After submitting his testimony to the judge, Link made the following statement: "I would have thought that both my daughter and I were dreaming if it were not for the following element involved. When the object disappeared, I went to the place where it had been. I found a circular opening in the ground and it was quite evident that it had been freshly dug. It was exactly the same shape as the conical tower. I was then convinced that I was not dreaming." Link continued, "I had never heard of the term flying saucer before I escaped from the Soviet zone into West Berlin. When I saw this object, I immediately thought that it was a new Soviet military machine. I confess that I was seized with fright because the Soviets did not want anyone to know about their work. Many people have been restricted in their movements for many years in East Germany because they know too much." Grand-Mère. 2 small beings in white that were surveying a garden. The central office of the AQUA, Association Québécoise d'Ufologie, recently pondered a rather uncommon case. The call concerned a sighting report made by a woman residing in Grand-Mère, of which the description of the events remains one of the most mysterious ones to have been given to us since the creation of the AQUA, said Chairman Gilles Millet. 3 AQUA representatives, along with Representative Pauline Mongrain, who crossed Street Maurice River, in order to verify the authenticity of certain facts observed by the witness, went over to see this information for themselves. It was, therefore, 8:30 p.m. on the night of October 24, 1998, when Mrs. H, coming out of the shower, saw two biological entities completely covered in white from head to toe, who seemed to be very interested in the neighbor's garden, in this case, her sister, related Milet. The two entities were described by the witness as being dressed like astronauts, wearing some kind of helmet on their heads. One of the creatures was leaning over and seemed to be picking something up off the ground. The other stood nearby. According to the witness, when they walked, they seemed to float. Their walk was unnatural. Their size and physical appearance were similar to that of humans. The witness saw a thick fog composed of various bright color nuances, the most prominent of which was brown. The glow had a diameter of approximately 25 to 30 feet and was located 75 feet from the witness house. Nowhere else was the fog present. After about 3 minutes of observation, realizing what she was seeing, the witness pulled away from the window, and, a few moments later, when she returned, the entities had disappeared and the fog was moving away in the opposite direction. When visited by our representative, ground traces were noted and photographed. There were 2 that were 12 inches in diameter and 2 that were 10 inches in diameter. Soil samples were taken and will be analyzed as soon as possible. We also visited Mrs. H, sister, and we noticed that where the entities were seen, there was a garden consisting of a variety of vegetables. The main witness is 72 years old, an independent and intelligent person who does not want any publicity. She saw something real, but what was its origin? That's what we are attempting to find out, admits Milet, faced with this puzzle. Last spring, after the thaw set in, we discovered holes 2 inches in diameter and the soil was 8 inches deep, and the dirt was different than the rest of the garden. The witness drew a sketch of what she saw that night. Who dug these small holes? On May 5th, the representatives of the ACWA went to the observation site along with the eyewitness in the hopes of finding other clues. Robert LeBlond. We have recreated the setting by asking Mrs. H to show us where the entities were. With precision, she showed us the spot, explains Gilles Milet. That's when 5 identical holes of 2 inches in diameter by 8 inches deep were discovered. Photos were taken. Some footprints which seemed to correspond to club feet were also noted. Soil samples were collected and the members of the ACWA noticed a great difference in the texture of the dirt. The dirt found inside the hole seemed to have been completely sieved and was brown in color, while the dirt outside the holes, from 1 to 20 feet away, was of a thick consistency and rich like normal garden black earth, said Milet. We are very perplexed about this report. This observation is very mysterious and brings together, in one event, most of the elements that we encounter in many other reports. We're continuing our research, but we seek the help of your readers so that they can tell us of other similar cases elsewhere in the province of Quebec.